to today's webinar. We are so happy to have you join us today for yet another wonderful presentation by a professional individual who has been in her field for many years. Ms. Soha Dardashti earned her Master of Science in Educational and Psychological Counseling, Marriage Family Therapy, with distinction from California State University, Northridge in 2008. Soha began her clinical work by providing psychotherapy to children, teens, adults with exposure to a multitude of traumas, including but not limited to sexual abuse, domestic violence, immigration, and divorce. Ms. Dardashti continued to provide services for various agencies contracted with the Department of Mental Health for nearly a decade before committing to her full-time private practice in 2016. We at Bridge to Success, we are so happy to have her here and speak to us about how to improve your wellness by shifting perspective. So, Ms. Dardashti, welcome, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation. And thank you to the friends who are accompanying us on this journey today. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me today. It's an absolute pleasure for me to be with all of you. So I know that your beautiful organization focuses on wellness in general as well. So I just wanted to have a brief talk on how we can make some shifts here and there to improve our own wellness. I guess I would start from pointing out the obvious, that our well-being is divided into two major aspects. One is our physical well-being, and the other is our emotional, psychological well-being. Our body has its own indicator of communicating with us on how well we're doing physically. It shows us some symptoms from time to time. For instance, if we're running a fever or if we have pain in our body, it's an indicator that something is off with our system, and we need to do something about it. Likewise, our psychological well-being has a complex and fascinating defense mechanisms in order to protect itself, and also communicates with us on how well we're doing emotionally and psychologically. Sometimes we have some physical indications of if we're experiencing some emotional difficulties. So for instance, it's very common to have headaches that are related to stress, fatigue that is related to ongoing anxiety or depression, for instance, so on and so forth. And I think our emotional well-being has a little bit more of a subtle way of communicating with us. The symptoms are not as obvious as perhaps our physical health is. So I wanted to introduce a few components of our daily functioning that gets affected rather quickly by any distress or any issues with our emotional health. And this would be some symptoms or some indicators for us as individuals to keep in mind, of keeping track of how well we're feeling, how well we're doing functioning in our day-to-day life. So one aspect that very directly gets affected by us emotionally suffering from something is our sleep. The other component is our appetite. So some people get more hungry more often, or their appetite increases when they're having some stress or emotional issues. The other aspect is our mood. So we might be very upbeat one day and have a lot of energy emotionally and physically speaking, and some days we may not. So that's another component that is sort of symptomatic of how well we're doing emotionally. Another aspect is our motivation, which is pretty similar to our mood, but to some aspect, to some perspective, it might be a little bit different. For us to lack motivation for very day-to-day things that we usually do without much effort. Some days we may need a lot more, so on and so forth. So I think I wanted to open up a little bit more on what I mean by this topic of shifting perspective. And in order to do that, I need to back up a little bit and talk about how we function as human beings, as a combination between our physical and our emotional functioning. As human beings, we are a informational entity. Through our five senses, from the minute that we're born, we receive information. We hear things, we see things, we touch things, we taste and we smell. So this is the way that our surroundings, and whether that surrounding is our environment at large, the community we live in, the city we live in, our home, for young children, the caregivers, and all this information that is sent to our system is received by obviously our nervous system and the brain. And within our nervous system is composed of many what is the word that I'm looking for? Um, uh, Centers of, for instance, information that received. I'll just give you an example. I do have a center for language in my brain. So if I was speaking as a Persian American, as a child, I was speaking to in Persian, I do have this network. That's the word that I was looking for. I have this network within my nervous system that is composed of words that I've heard. But interesting enough is that there's also a very emotional component that is attached to these words that I've heard. For instance, I have certain connections to the same word that another Persian speaker may not have. Maybe a word that is a word of endearment that was used by, let's say, my beloved grandparents or my beloved parents, has a unique place in that network of language for me. What I'm trying to point at is that for us, there is a very direct collaboration between what we have as a physical entity and an emotional entity within every network of information that we have. And when there is a positive correlation with those physical information that we have, that network can work very positively, and it can have a different effect in our day-to-day life and our well-being. So for instance, if one of those words, and I'm going to use the English version of it, is, let's say, my darling. Every time that I hear that word, it's sort of like, let's imagine, and this is a very basic way of explaining how the brain and memory works, but let's imagine that every emotion has a drawer of its own in our brain. And when that word is mentioned, or that feeling rather is mentioned, that drawer is opened. And every time throughout my life I experience that feeling, those experiences throughout my life that was related to that emotion kind of comes to the surface. So let's say joy is one of these drawers that is related to the word darling for me. So if even a stranger for the first time says, "So, darling, how are you doing?" that drawer of emotional experiences opens, and all of those positive experiences overflows. As I'm explaining this word and using joy, I noticed that sort of my body moved upward and there was additional energy in me. I don't know if it was visible to friends who are watching me. It was visible in some of your faces because I was paying attention to some of the faces that have their cameras open, and I noticed there was an uplifting movement in the faces of friends. So what I mean by perspective is that combination of all of the experiences that I had throughout my life that is related to this one positive word that is giving me a lot of positive perspective. But obviously, none of us has ever lived in a vacuum, and no one will ever live in a vacuum. And we have many, many emotions, and those drawers open a lot of Pandora boxes, perhaps. And throughout the day, we do remember and we are reminded of some negative experiences in life. Because no matter who we are, we have many experiences of traumas in our past. Traumas exist on a spectrum. It could be something that was perhaps only to one level of trauma that we have been easily able to process it. It doesn't get in the daily functioning of our life, all the way through the extreme where it was something that every time a word or an experience, a smell, a taste of something takes us back to that trauma, or a trigger to that trauma can sort of switch our perception, therefore our perspective of not just that event, but our current time and what we're experiencing right now. I want to also take a segue to explain a little bit about what generally happens to us during a traumatic event. Let's imagine, as most of us do, we are driving and we're looking around, keeping an eye on everything, and all of a sudden, through the rear view mirror, we notice that a car is approaching really fast. They're driving recklessly, and it seems like they may crash into our car. So that scene that I just saw in that rear view mirror is sending those messages to the brain: danger. So an automatic system, which is our fight flight system, sort of engages. And that's the part of the brain that starts taking control, which we have in common with even the very primary human beings. So it's a very basic in a meaning of primary. Part of our brain says Soha is in danger. The very first thing that happens is that the brain sends the message that she does not have the luxury of time, thinking, logical thinking, making decisions. So we're going to switch to reaction. And therefore, the body sort of pumps all the bloods from every organ and sends them to the muscles, to our arms and legs. The eyes dilate so that they can transfer light faster. So in a sense, we can see faster, we can register what we see much quicker. Some chemicals in the body gets produced, which makes us move faster and hear more accurately, so that we can save ourselves from death, pretty much. And this system of fight and flight gets activated on its own in order to save us so that we don't die. But the problem with modern day is that We are rarely ever chased by a wild animal or by natural disasters that, for instance, would destroy our homes that we built with leaves and trees or inside a cave, which is, remember, the primary part of the brain. So if we hear a really loud noise from outside, that system of fight and flight can get triggered. And the more stressed we are, the more negative experiences we have been going through, the faster and the quicker the system gets engaged. But we do have an issue as human beings. This is a automatic system that starts, but it does not turn off automatically. We have to learn to turn the switch off. So initially, we become, in a sense, a victim of our surrounding or whatever that potential danger was. But we have to make a very conscious decision to remind ourselves, our system, that the danger has passed and I'm okay. But we can very easily look into our own pasts and our own experiences and recognize that certain things that historically happened in the past are very much in the present with us. And every one of those events contribute to our perception as us not being in a safe environment, potentially being in danger. And remember, I mentioned that when fight and flight system is engaged, we don't think, we don't make decisions, and we only react. So imagine if at any point the system has gotten engaged and it hasn't been completely turned off. We do react instead of deciding and make a conscious decision. That's why when we are stressed out, we have the tendency to snap at loved ones. Snapping per se, or being a little bit short-tempered, or being a little bit restless, not being as patient, these are forms of our body reacting because it's telling us, if you're asking me for too much, or if you're pressuring me to make a decision or a choice, I don't have that luxury right now. So imagine if we have even a tiny bit of every traumatic experience that we have gone through, if they're even affecting us slightly in our 30s, in our 40s, in our 50s, we have so many of those events going on. How realistic is our perception of our reality? Not much. And as research shows, people who have gone through rather really serious traumas, if they don't consciously remind themselves repeatedly that they are okay, that they are safe, that they are doing well, they may have the tendency to react to events and to things. So how well can I sleep if, for instance, I have memories of, let's say, an earthquake that was pretty severe? I live in California, and we are very prone to earthquakes. And there was a rather strong one in 1994. I do vividly remember that earthquake. It happened very early in the morning. Look at me. I'm referring to something that happened many years ago, and I have very vivid uh, recollection of it. And if I wasn't able to process that event within any movement, I would react and, oh my gosh, is that an earthquake? Is it the big one? We have this saying that there's going to be a very big earthquake eventually in California. So if that trauma is more in the present with me, that is going to give me some intense sleepless nights. And in emotional psychological things, we don't have MRIs, we don't have blood works to give us a range of numerical way of saying how an event has affected us. So for that 1994 earthquake, the way I know how it has affected me is how symptomless or how many symptoms is affecting me. So if I have nights that I can't sleep, keep thinking about that earthquake, that is an indicator that that earthquake was very traumatic for me. Maybe to 10 other people, they haven't even thought about it for the past 10, 20 years. So that indication of not having symptoms or being asymptomatic is the way that we determine how traumatic or not an event was for an individual. Because there are many studies that 5 people are in a vehicle, they were involved in a car accident. As soon as the car accident happens, they separate the 5 individuals and they ask them to recall what happened. They get 5 different scenarios. And that's not because one of them is not being truthful, one of them wasn't paying attention. Yes, maybe one of them was asleep. But that's the case because we can only perceive things through our 5 senses. So if somebody was asleep and their eyes were closed, they couldn't have as much of a visual perception as someone who was wide awake and they were looking around. But we're not even only limited to our 5 senses. We may have a vision of 20/20 that we don't need even corrective lenses to see, but our emotional experiences can play a limiting ability in our recollection. For instance, if out of those 5 people, one of them was in a really extremely horrific car accident. I tried to use as many words that I could to explain that it was a really severe car accident in the past. They may actually not be able to recall as much because that fight and flight mode was activated to prevent them from recalling that previous event that they did have. I just remembered something fascinating, and that is our body and our mind does not have the capability of remembering pain. Because if we had that ability, imagine many years of a broken bone or a headache or a stomach cramp or a stomach flu, all of these adding up, it would have brought us down to our knees and broke us. But the same thing doesn't work for our our emotional psychological being. We have a capacity to store all of them and recall them all as if it is happening to us right now. So that's the conscious decision that we need to make in order to turn that fight and flight mode off, process what happened to us, and change the narrative of what happened to me as something that happened in the past and it stopped. It is not continuous. So going back to the example of those 5 people in the vehicle, if somebody had a previous traumatic experience, they may completely be unable to recall what just happened to them because the emotional overwhelmness of what they were already processing from the past kind of short circuit what happened in the moment. So another thing is that stress and our emotional, psychological well-being, if it's not well taken care of, it even affects our memory. Most of us think that we're getting older and we're becoming forgetful. Yes, that is a part of it. But a bigger part of it is as we get older, since we have like a huge suitcase of events that we're dragging around with us from the past, we're actually more distracted than forgetful. So I know that we do have a limited time today, but um, with the time that we have, I just wanted to point out to the fact that in life, we don't make the decisions of the things that do happen to us. We do become a victim of certain things, but in order to be able to process them and move forward in our life, and I don't mean to forget things. When somebody loses a loved one and they pass on, they're never going to forget them, and nobody wants to forget them. But in order to process that heaviness of grief and loss, we have to make that conscious decision that I'm going to not forget that loved one, but I'm going to relearn how to continue to live without that person being present in my life. And that's the conscious decision of becoming a survivor. And when we make that switch, we are shifting our perspective. When we decide to process any traumatic event into something that did happen to us in the past, is a part of me, but doesn't define me, is what allows us to shift our perspective. I'm going to use another driving example. For me to be the driver of my life, to be the driver of my destiny, I have to make sure my emotions are the passengers in the car. So when I'm driving and the rear view mirror tells me that there's a reckless driver coming from the back, I take advantage of the emotion of fear. I bring it on. It becomes the co-pilot, co-driver. It saves my life. When I'm done with fear, when that car drove by, when I'm safe, I have to kiss fear goodbye and tell him, you're off duty now. Go back to the passenger seat, so that I can make decisions for my own life. If I don't bid goodbye, if I don't kiss goodbye to the fear, it becomes very egoistic, and it says, why don't you let me drive the rest of the day? And they're pretty manipulative. Negative emotions such as fear, tiredness, restlessness, anxiety, depression, they're very manipulative. They try to talk you out of reality and take you into a delusion. So when we give the driving wheel to fear, we only drive in the road of fear and unknown and unexpected. And yes, there are those aspects to life, but that's not what life is all about. And that is exactly what happens if we don't make that conscious decision that, hey, that car accident could have happened, but it didn't. You know how sometimes we dwell on things and we're like, oh, but what if it did happen? I had my nephew in the car and I had my dog in the other seat. What if they flew out the window? You see, all these what ifs is the best friend of fear, which is anxiety. Human mind at a state of calmness and serenity is creative beyond imagination. Has invented airplanes, spaceships, refrigerator, anything that we use on daily basis. On the other hand, lack of calmness, which is anxiety, chaos, can create a delusion that can, reality can be never that scary and dark. So we have to make a choice to only listen to our mind and dwell in it when it's calm. When it's not calm is the biggest, fattest liar it can ever exist. And our perception as an individual, my perception, which is made out of my experiences and my abilities, is only my reality. It's interesting that our anxiety is a world that exists between these two ears. It doesn't have a real existence. But boy, do we fall for that lie. And then it affects our physical health, it affects our sleep. We overeat or we stop eating. We don't socialize as much. We don't show up to work on time. We make mistakes more often. So that's our perspective. My perspective is only mine. And yes, reality is that today is Saturday. Some of you friends are in Atlanta. I'm here in California. So if I look at the clock, is a certain hour here, but for Atlanta is a different hour. And that reality is the same. But how I am sitting here and how well I feel, how excited I am, how cold I am, how comfortably I'm sitting is my perspective. If I don't like the fact that I'm feeling a little chilly, I better get up, either, turn on the heater or get a sweater and modify that perspective. Because I can have 10 other people in this room and I'll be the only one who's feeling cold. Can they tell me, oh no, it's not cold. What are you talking about? It's 80 degrees. No, that is my reality. If I'm cold in 80 degrees, I better check my body. I may be running a fever or might have an infection. And that's the way my body is trying to communicate with me and say something is off. But I want to be in that vehicle again, be the driver of my own destiny. And the only way to do that is to make sure that my emotions and my experiences are just there with me for the ride and they are not driving me. We can, on daily basis, have a checklist. And that's how I'm going to wrap up for today. Let's have 5 indicators for ourselves on daily basis. And at least once a day, I think we owe it to ourselves to take less than 5 minutes a day to sit down and say, how am I doing? Just check in with ourselves. How did I sleep last night? How rested am I? How have I been eating today? Have I eaten at least every 3 hours? How healthy was that? How much protein was there? How many glasses of water have I had? And perhaps, maybe for me as a therapist, the most important one for me is, how am I doing? How am I feeling, really? You know, how is it like we get on an elevator and a total stranger says, how are you? And then the short, very diplomatic answer is, very well, thank you. How are you? Fine, thank you. Okay, well, we can give that answer to them on the elevator, but let's just check in. And it's a complex question to answer, so I'll give you some hints. How relaxed are my shoulders? Not as relaxed as they can be, I guarantee you. It doesn't matter who you are. So let's drop them. Let me take a deep breath through my nose and out through my mouth. And let me just do a little stretch of my arms. And let me wiggle my toes. I think that took less than 5 minutes. That gives us a really ballpark of how well we're doing. and it's very doable every day. If you didn't check in as well as you wanted for how well you slept last night, let's do something about it. Luckily, we do live in a time where information and unfortunately misinformation is at our fingertips. Let me look it up. How can I improve my sleep? Modify the temperature, modify the lighting, play some soothing noise or perhaps white noise in the room, and so on and so forth. And one last thing, again, not just because I'm a therapist, but talking about our experiences is one thing. Overthinking about them is another thing. When therapists like myself refer to process your emotions, process what happened to you, we're not just saying tell your neighbor or your best friend what happened, because that can turn into overthinking or overtalking. There is a trick into what can turn expressing and talking about events into processing them, which requires, for instance, if you're talking about, again, being behind the wheel, driving as we all do as Americans, we're driving most of our lives on the road, and somebody passed by and I almost got into an accident. So what turns that storytelling into processing what happened requires you to continue to regulate yourself emotionally as you continue to tell the story. Remember that click or that button that needs to be turned off for flight and flight. So one technique of doing that is to do a self-talk. Remind yourself, I was on the road, but I'm okay now. I'm safe now. So that's one way of distinguishing the difference between overthinking or over talking with somebody about an experience versus processing what happened. So that indicator is make sure that the more you're talking about it, the more you're bringing yourself to the here and now. That is the most precise indicator of a person who is processing an event. Remember, the more we live in the moment, the more reality we are experiencing. The more we foresee the future and stress about it, the more anxious we get. The more we travel back in time, the more depressed we get. So that processing of emotions, the focus of that is to bring us to here and now. And that being of here and now, put the perspective and the focus in reality versus the past or the future. And that's how that perspective can contribute positively to our well-being. I think that is my time for today.
Thank you so much to Ms. Dardashti for such a beautiful and detailed presentation. Appreciate your insights into how we can improve our wellness, our mental wellness, by shifting our perspective. And we do hope to have you in our future webinars for more detailed look into other aspects of mental wellness.